Welcome to Thursday Book Club with my guest, Tom Keneally. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. For anyone new with us tonight, my name's Suzanne Leal. I'm the author of the novels The Deceptions, The Teacher's Secret and Border Street. My first children's book, Running with Ivan, will be out in February. Now, again, for those of you who are new, I started Thursday Book Club during the 2020 COVID lockdown. It was a way I thought that I might be able to connect readers and writers online. So it's been well over 2 years. Hard to imagine, isn't it, that we've been with COVID for almost 2.5 years. And we've continued to meet weekly on Zoom with a guest writer coming up once a month for us. If you'd like to know more about Thursday Book Club, please sign up on my website, which is suzanneleal.com. But now, the reason you're all here tonight is to meet Tom Keneally. Now, if this was not a book club, but instead a quiz show, and contestants were asked to name our best known, most loved writer, I think Tom Keneally would be right up there at the top of the list. Tom's first book was published in 1964, and since then he has published, and Tom may correct me if I'm wrong, 35 novels, 20 books of non-fiction, 5 plays and 3 screenplays. He's won the Booker Prize once. He's been shortlisted on it for 3 other occasions. He's won the Miles Franklin Award twice and the Helmerich and Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Fiction once each. But most important of all, Tom, you are a 55-cent stamp, are you not?
Yes, have been, yeah. Been on parcels all over the place.
How did you find out you were going to be a stamp? Do you get a call from?
You get a call from the post office and discussion of what images you'd like to use. And of course, not being an oil painting, you have to be realistic about how magisterial you look on the stamp. I made a cheap joke about it that, you know, getting your back licked, but they don't lick them anymore. They're self-adhesive. So I couldn't fall back on the fact that it would be, yes, well, I won't get into sexist daydreams about but apart from that, it was a great honor, even in a time when the stamp is somewhat dying, the way cash money is somewhat dying.
Yeah.
And the banknote is somewhat dying. And such a, well, my period as a writer upon this earth has seen extraordinary changes both in society and in the consciousness of Australians about their continent, about their place in the world, about, I think we're in a much happier place than when I was born in 1935.
What makes you say that? What are 2 aspects that makes you think that we're happier now?
Well, I think of A.D. Hope's book about Australia, his poem about Australia, in which he describes it as a place where second-class Europeans pullulate timidly on the edge of alien shores. I think we do more than pullulate these days. He describes Australia as again, risking feminist comment, he describes Australia as a woman beyond her change of life, outwardly living, inward, he says, the womb is dry. This idea that we had then, teachers used to tell little Australians like me, the center of your continent is a dead heart. So that was just, no wonder we grew up screwed up, because that was just one image that was planted upon us, one Eurocentric image from a time when the middle of Australia was still a dangerous, dead place where Burke and Wills and Leichhardt and others went to die, la Voss. And so I think that we've got over that feeling of Australia being a place of second-rate Europeans. I think we're more interested in our diversity and the various strains of our heritage. I think that's what takes our attention now, rather than negativities. And so altogether, I think that as a group relating to the continent, we're in a happier place. For example, we now, and many of us acknowledge the validity, we now recognize the ancient occupation of Australia by Homo sapiens, Aboriginals who were of the same species as us. And they landed in Australia a long time ago and were the only place where humans entered at the head of the zoological chain, if you like, in that I know that's a dangerous way to look at things, up the head, etc. But we didn't have any hominids already here to kill off or to come to terms with, to absorb their genes. Or the human species entered Australia and encountered its remarkable megafauna at the very head as the only hominids on the continent. And this fascinates me in a way that I couldn't be fascinated when I was a kid, because we didn't know how long the Aboriginals had been here. In my childhood, it was said to be 15,000. So increasingly, when I was a kid also, people talked about going home, and they meant Britain. And if you're a lucky Australian, you got a trip home. Many thousands of men enlisted in the armed forces and gave their lives for their trip home. Now home for us in Australia is a more diffuse, a more varied definition than the simple Anglo-Celtic definition it had in my childhood. And so our origins are simply more diverse, and this creates healthier questions than used to occupy us.
Interesting, you were talking about the wars and fighting for Britain. And in much of your writing, you are interested in war and its effects. Your most recent novel is Corporal Hitler's Pistol. It came out last year, and it's set in 1933 in Kempsey. Now, early on in the book, for those who haven't read it, there's the most arresting scene. Bert Weber, who'd fought in the First World War, stands up during the screening of a film at a local cinema, and he screams and he screams and he screams. Why is he screaming, Tom?
He sees a corporal from whom he took a pistol in 1916, is now Chancellor. He sees Droopy, this character he nicknamed Droopy, and took prisoner on the night of July 19th, 1916. There is a story in Kempsey that on the night of July 19th, the Battle of Fromelles, when the 53rd Battalion of the Australian Forces was directly opposite Hitler's battalion, Hitler's regiment, the 16th Bavarian Reserve Regiment, that a Kempsey boy took Hitler prisoner and took a pistol from him. And that pistol comes back to Kempsey and sleeps in someone's cupboard until it awakens when Hitler awakens as Chancellor in 1933, and it's used in a murder. So this was one of the not impossible urban or rural rustic myths of Kempsey, that someone up there, a cranky old dairy farmer, too cranky for you to speak to, had Hitler's pistol from World War I in his possession. And that is one of the strains of this book. And I am fascinated by connections between Australia, the Australia of my past, for example, and the big world. I'm fascinated by the fact that there was a Russian escaped prisoner, for example, who became Bolshevik commissar of transport, who lived in Brisbane during World War I. I'm fascinated by the fact that an Australian family, an English family, young English family with whom Napoleon got close on St. Helena, were themselves sent to Australia for getting too close to Napoleon. These connections with the big world, which one finds in Australia, have always fascinated me. And I think that what fascinates me, I saw Australia as very cut off. We all did. Mm-hmm. But particularly in the days when the only ways members of your family got a trip overseas was to fight in foreign wars. But the connections between the old world and the new world have always fascinated me. I suppose it's partly Catholicism, because we Aussie hillbillies were saying the same Mass in Latin as the Germans were, and the Austrians, and the English, and the French, and therefore a sense that we had a connection with Europe. And then during World War II, my father used to send me back from North Africa memorabilia from the Africa Corps in cake tins, in Australian Comforts Fund cake tins. The cake was eaten. He would send me back loot in this taped up cake tin. And you'd open it, you'd never know what was in there. The wonderful Italian fascists postcards from Libya. There were Egyptian sandalwood camels. There was once an Australian Comforts Fund rugby league football. To have your own leather football in Sydney in 1942-43 was absolute heaven. It made you an important member of society at the age of 7. I still have a lot of this bric-a-brac from the war front, and I look at it, and there is a great mystery behind it, because we Australians were the supportive. If you'd use a word like Australian literature and Australian culture, it would have been a one-liner that made Europeans laugh. It would have nominated an impossibility. But the point is that our betters did worse things than we did, even taking in what we did to the Aboriginals. And that always fascinated me, that the people who attended the same Mass and so on. So I always had a bit of a European consciousness, I have to say. And my father's feeding of it through these memorabilia, I think you can see it in my work. Now, your work has the same thing, almost the yearning for a kind of European moment, a European importance, casting light on our universal experience in Australia. But that I was always drawn to the people who had this connection with the big world.
Yeah.
Now, in the book on Kempsey, Corporal Hitler, there's also an assassination. The pistol is used in an assassination of an IRA man who became an informer. These assassinations occurred.
Sorry.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, I'm sorry. That was I think that was my mistake. I'll take responsibility for that one.
Oh, well, you're shorting things down anyhow. These connections with Europe and the big world have always fascinated me. And so you see it in Corporal Hitler's pistol, but the Antipodean question in that, my mother said that the gay cinema pianist, Chicken Dalton in Kempsey, his real name was Chicken Weeks. He used to make up Aboriginal women. My daughter was my mother was a shop girl in Kempsey at Barsby's Kempsey, and she used to sell this gay pianist who was tolerated because he was a near musical genius, you know, and certainly a virtuoso by the standards of the Macleay Valley. He used to make up the Aboriginal women if they were coming to Sydney. And the idea of this frustrated film talent, Chicken, making up Aboriginal women, the marginalised making up the marginalised, I thought that's got to be in a book. That's got to be in a bloody book. And
I think, and with that one too, Tom, Chicken is called Chicken for a very specific reason. Tell me, why did he get to be called Chicken?
Well, Chicken used to hypnotise chickens, his mother, and was known throughout Kempsey as Chicken Weeks because his chickens never woke up. They ended up in his father was a sleeper cutter, a very ill-paid, highly skillful job of cutting sleepers for the railway that men used to do. So thanks to young Chicken learning to hypnotize chickens so thoroughly, they were never short of a meal. Chicken taught my father how to do it, and during World War II, my father, who was something of a character, not a quite reserved chap like me, he used to hypnotize chickens all over the Middle East. If he ever got into trouble in Tunisia or Libya, he just hypnotized a few chickens and all the locals would clap and think he was a great man. Anyhow.
I'm going to take you back, Tom. I'm going to take you back, well, not as far as the war, but a little bit further. I'm going to take you to 1982. When you won the Booker Prize. Now, I'm just trying to put myself in your shoes. When did you find out? How did you find out that you'd won the Booker?
That night, I found out.
So you didn't know? So
I didn't know. I can see I had a few clues beforehand dropped by persons I shall not name, but I just didn't believe them. And there was a novelist up that night who was the favorite, William Boyd. Now, William Boyd, I've always followed. I've always loved his work. I always thought he was an undervalued British author. And there are many undervalued British and Australian authors. And I was pretty sure he was going to win it. And so it was just a big night out for me. You know, amongst my British peers, and I did not know until it was announced. And people don't. It makes for some interesting scenes at the Booker.
Is it good or bad? Do you? I mean, if you were organising it, do you think the winner should be told, or do you think the element of surprise is too good to lose?
I think that, that the element of surprise is very much part of it, and in a sense too good to lose. Now it has, if you win it, it has a benign effect. But being shortlisted, I think being shortlisted should have bigger effect. Yes, I remember, however, that it has this wonderful effect. You've won the Mars Franklin, haven't you?
No. Maybe that's prescient of you.
Yes.
But
So it won't be long.
maybe you're the soothsayer. But
well, what happens, of course, if you lose a prize, it's easy to work out why. The jury, in their literary narrow-mindedness, were too blind to see the value, the groundbreaking value of your work. But if you win it, your work, you can say, has an authority that even the judges could not ignore. And therefore, I remember giving a lecture with, the reason I asked you about prizes, I was giving a lecture in Calcutta once with a woman called, she's a novelist.
It'll come.
Her mother's a novelist. She won the Booker Prize for a great book on northern India.
And Desai,
Desai, yeah. Now, she said she'd written about 3 books when she won the Booker. And she said she wasn't convinced whether she was a novelist. The most important thing the Booker did for her was that she thought, God, I must be a novelist. This jury thinks I'm a novelist. I must be a novelist. And I can understand that validation coming from a prize to people. Now, the Booker is purely, I mean, honestly, to be honest, it's lottery. But there you are. I'm not looking that particular gift horse in the mouth, but it is true that it's a shock when it happens. And Peter Carey, who's a far more, in many ways, a shy man than me, he said that it's like being hit by a bus. And it is a bit like being hit by a bus, but it's the bus you've been looking to be run over by all your life.
Let's talk a little bit about Schindler's Ark itself. Now, most people will know the book, but just as a recap, so it's a story of Oskar Schindler, who's a member of the Nazi Party, who becomes the most unlikely hero when he saves the lives of over 1,000, I think 1,200 people during the Holocaust. Now, Tom, you've said that the seed for your novels is a story, or at least the fragment of a story. How did you find this story?
Well, now, it was interesting, in the 70s, we were starting to create our own cinema, our directors were. And I did some work with a director called Fred Kempsey, and his Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith was shown in Italy, and he couldn't go, and he wanted me to go to this festival on his behalf, or the Australians invited me to. So I did, and we had a great riotous time, and I was coming home when I met a luggage salesman in a little store in Beverly Hills, a neighborhood kind of store, where I was buying a briefcase. I met a survivor. Now, this survivor, his name was Leopold Pfefferberg. That's a German name. Has my picture disappeared?
No, we've got you. We've got
excellent. Tell me if there are any problems.
Yes.
And I went to this briefcase store, and I wanted to get in and get out with my new briefcase, but there was a considerable delay, and I got talking to the owner. The owner was an extraordinary character named Leal. There are a lot of Austrian names out of Krakow in Poland because it used to be an Austrian province. And in any case, Polgek had been through the Holocaust and his wife had. Now listen, kids, I've lost you, the picture of you, and I'm just going to try to get it back.
Okay.
So I can continue this. I don't know what the press.
We can see you. We're actually really good, Tom. So
Excellent.
and
Good.
you
I'm
can't
back
see me.
with you.
Good.
And this man, I looked at this man. He showed me a list of Schindler's Factory from early 1944 or late 1944, the Schindler's List. And on it, he says, there I am. And there's my wife's name, Misha, beautiful Misha. And she is described as a Metalarbeiter, a metal worker, which she had never been in her life before. She was a medical student. And he is described as a Schlosser, which I think is a welder. In any case, I look at these two people in this, by then we're in the back room, the repair room of the handbag and luggage store. And I look at these two people, one an exuberant, loud man, and I've looked the devil in the eye once, and I'm never going to back away from him. He was an extraordinary character. And then he's much quieter, more intellectual wife, urbane. Don't be so bombastic to the poor man, she would say, things like that. And both of them on a death list, both of them on what is seen as a death list. And it's Hitler wanted these two people dead. These two people are speaking to in 1981 in a store in 1980, rather, in a store in Beverly Hills. My betters, my metropolitan betters, had thought that these two people must die for the health of European culture, that they were a virus on European culture that had to be exterminated. And here they were, entertaining me, making me welcome. And I thought, you were on a death list on a delusional basis. It never came home to me before I met these two. I'd never seen a death list before. And I really wanted to write about that. And then in my, the question of virtue arose and of sin. Now, Schindler was a great sinner. He was a ruined Catholic like me. And very much a sinner against the principles of Me Too, actually. He needs a new book done on him by a member of the Me Too generation. But in any case, he wasn't virtuous. The fact that the paradox of his nature was so profoundly deep was very attractive. And the fact that he wanted to come back a wealthy man. He actually didn't spend all his wealth on his business. He spent money for him, and he spent a lot of it on saving them. But the fact that he wasn't a saint and that conventional virtue was not as potent in that situation, was such an inhuman arrangement. That virtue was upside down, everything was upside down, language was upside down. The Nazis started that, and we've never stopped. Marketing took up from where the Nazis left off, using terms like retrenchment. And in any case, the that all fascinated me, but I felt I couldn't write about it because I didn't know any Jews. I didn't know. And yet my father had been involved with the people who thought the Holocaust, who as a regime at least, thought the Holocaust was a real goer and an objective they had to fulfill in their unification. They were trying to unify Europe too. In their unification of Europe, they were going to obliterate this ancient virus on the Aryan race. And my father was campaigning at a time when we fancied ourselves as a super race too, too good to live with our Asian neighbors and so on in white Australia. And so this question of race has always engrossed me, and the levels to which we are willing to drive it. But it was astounding how far to me the Nazis had driven it to save Ludmila and Poldek Pfefferberg from infecting Europe. Well, the story is they weren't a virus on anything, Ludmila and Poldek. And I was fascinated by what they had been through. And then I started meeting their Australian friends. There was a wonderful Australian called Edek Korn, who had been the other welder in Hitler's, in
Schindler?
Schindler's prison. And I just wanted to write about them. I thought it was wonderful. My new book that's coming out in November, which is called Fanatic Heart, is also about race. It's about a convict who actually existed and who escaped from Van Diemen's Land after living there for some years, and who, having been a champion of the miserable of the famine, the Irish who died like flies in the bloody famine because it wasn't understood by Westminster. He feels himself a brother to them, but he feels that his brothers are the industrial slaves of the capitalists north of America. And he thinks that the slaves are better off on the plantations because the owner has invested in them. When he was a Southerner, John Mitchell, this escaped convict, and entered the Civil War in America, ultimately lost 2 of his Tasmanian sons. He was very influenced by the racial theories of the time and the theory of the head. I pat my head because, according to phrenology, I've got a criminal head. It wasn't my head. So a lot of convicts with the same shape at the back of the head as I've got were transported. So, of course, if you look at criminal heads, you saw one like that. But in any case, all that false science of the period was in favor of the Africans being a lesser race. And he defended slavery on the basis that it was a more humane system. As I said, there was a lot of abuse in slavery, and I don't defend it for a moment. And I think he was wrong. He goes wrong, this convict. But the point is that it is still true that in the industrial slaves get treated badly by capitalism. And it is still true the concerns he had about the nakedness of American capitalism, which has generated everything from the Trump people. It's generated a whole generation of Americans feel they're being disinherited by the system. And it's generated people who feel the same way in Australia. And the government is at least looking at that, making noises about that disinherited 20% of Australians, because no society wants an unequal society. The economic rationalists, the neoliberals, might want it, but we don't want it. And I'm delighted to the extent that we voted against it in the last election. We voted, the people of Australia moved at last on this neoliberal bullshit that society is full of Catalinas, to quote hockey, and from that notorious 2014 budget. But I must now let you ask, but this convict saw aggressiveness of naked capitalism being a reason to defend slavery, and did so. But the first was he only covers them until after they escaped from Australia, he and his wife, and moved down to the Appalachians, rather, to the Great Smokies in Tennessee, and live amongst actually this convict who actually existed, settled in the Great Smokies amongst Dolly Parton's forebears. So there are Parton's little graveyard there. So I cover it until he thinks he finds the Jeffersonian ideal in the Great Smokies. But still, at every turn, that new novel in November about John Milton's wife, Jenny, a lot of it told from women's point of view, because he could escape from Tasmania on his own. She had to bring 6 kids with her when she left, and she had to make it all the way across Nicaragua with 6 kids on pack ponies, and then get all the way to New York on pack ponies. And then he kills 2 of the kids in the Civil War, in a sense. So the marriage goes through. And but the book again is about race. Race has always fascinated me since I was a little kid, because of 2 things. We, the Catholics, were considered not fully Australians. All the prejudices that are now heaped on top of Muslims were in those days heaped on top of us. But below us was this other race that had to be down by 6 p.m. every evening in their own country, had to be out of town. And that fighting for possession of the town. And they were the people. So race has always been, number one issue on my in my pantheon of issues.
And I must say, Tom, I mean, the enthusiasm with which you describe your ideas and your books, it seems never to abate. It seems like you have got ideas and ideas, and it's a race to get the ideas out. Is that how you feel?
I feel it a bit. Right. Some years ago, I gave a talk at the Australian Society of Authors of the novels that I wouldn't have time to write.
Yeah.
For example, there's a great novel about buggery when the colonial government in Tasmania became to do something about buggery in prisons in Port Arthur and elsewhere, and in timber camps and so on. And the official England was abashed by sexual relationships between men. And so they decided they were going to find a token committer of the sin of sodomite, and hang him. And it happened to be an 18-year-old Irish convict. They chose him, they executed him ritually with great publicity to say, this is how tough we are on sexuality between men. And yet it was endemic in the convict system. I don't think we've ever faced up with the fact that early Australia had an 8-to-1 disparity between, say, a woman convict and male convicts, 8-to-1. What does that do to a girl? What choices does she make? How does a woman negotiate her way to become a matriarch in a society like that? And they did it. They did it. Astounding. These female factory women, the opposite of what you'd expect, the opposite of what society describes them as. In any case, that is a great book that I don't think I'll ever get round to writing, never be able to write. And therefore, there was a book I wanted to write on Dickens' sons at the time, and I thought I couldn't write it because I had no memory of being a member of the English gentry. But ultimately I wrote it because the relationship between Plorn and his father was very like the relationship between me and my father. And after all, Dickens was really a knuckle-dragging proletarian. His grandparents were servants, so he wasn't really a gent. And so I fell back on this thing about the father with Dickens' son, Plorn, younger son, in Australia, and wrote a novel about that.
And is it true that that's the book you're most proud of, Tom?
I'm very, I really think it should be a movie, but then so should all yours. It's a very important book about why the English gentry sent Australia. They began by sending convicts, but they ended up sending their own son. And Australia was considered a great place to send boys who were good at cricket, interested in horses, but didn't have a formal education. And Dickens despaired about his son's education. Only one of Dickens' sons was bright and excelled at university and got a scholarship. Only one of them went to Eton, for example. And all the others were sent to the colonies. Why? How did they feel about that? And how did they try to ennoble the name of Dickens in Australia? And that's a very powerful impulse, the ghost of the father. Now, my father never fronted me and said, you have to be A, B, and C, and then I'll be proud of you. But I did try, even after his death and in my old age, I'm still governed by this presence of my father. And that is also a very interesting dynamic in the life of a boy and all his relationships. And in the case of young Dickens, in the Dickens boy, Dickens wrote a letter ultimately published in his collected letters, it's written 20 days before his death. And it's to his brother in the Barrier Rangers, Arthur Tennyson Dickens, whose godfather was Tennyson. And the way Bulwer Lytton was Plorn's, the youngest son's godfather. And he says, I don't think Plorn is making it in Australia. All he talks about is how happy he is riding around the bush, and he doesn't seem to have doesn't seem to be driven to become a leading colonial citizen. Now, this was very important to Dickens because he made Micawber, a hopeless debtor in England, an important Australian citizen. All this stuff, I mean, it's all good, great fun. The nature of Australia and guilt, you just about got me covered. And guilt and racism.
And we haven't even
got me pretty much covered.
We haven't even got started on that, Tom. I'm mindful of the time, and I'm just wanting to know if anyone has any questions. I've got plenty more, but probably have time for one, maybe two. So if you'd like to ask a question, could you please just put it in the chat, in the chat box, and I'll ask Tom. While we're waiting for that, Tom, I think my favorite book, or at least one of my favorite books of yours, is Daughters of Mars, and that's about nurses in the First World War. And what interests me is that your wife Judy is also a nurse. Was that one of the interests that sparked this book, or is that completely?
Yes, I used to go to Eritrea during the war between Eritrea and Mengistu, the Stalinist monster of Ethiopia, who's still alive in Zimbabwe, but in any case, living in exile. In any case, at the height of the famine, he was buying armaments. Anyhow, I wrote about all that, and Judy came with me to Eritrea once, and I noticed her reaction to things was very different. In some ways, she was very much tougher than me. I found Eritrea very hard to live with, even though the morale of the Eritreans was such that made a tough nut like Fred Hollows decide that they were the people who were going to become a just republic, and to put his lens facility built by Australian taxpayers into operation in Eritrea. And it still operates. It's still producing those cheaper lenses which enable the Africans to have cheap cataract operations. And Judy was, I found Judy very tough when it came to injuries. So I'd live with this woman who could become desperately distressed when her daughter's room was untidy, but was not distressed when we encountered a young woman, a nomadic woman, whose legs had been blown off by a Russian mine. And so I began to think women are differently constituted than us. And I looked at the nurses that had worked in the clearing stations in World War I. First of all, they had a big feminist fight. They didn't see it as that, but they fought to get rank so they would not be used as slavies by underqualified orderlies, so that they would not be subject to the orders, the indignities, the slurs, the verbal and physical abuse of orderlies. You see, up till the end of the invasion of Gallipoli, they had no rank in the Australian Army. And it was on Lemnos that they found their voice and said, no, we're not going to be further abused by either surgeons or orderlies. We are going to have a rank. But on top of that, they were not shocked by terrible injuries. And they could clear a clearing station of shell shock people, of people in wound shock, of chest wounds, abdominal wounds, extremity wounds, and so on. They could clear a clearing station of these injuries in a couple of days, while the dead were buried publicly. And the women then got used for a new influx of about 1,000 men suffering all this range of wounds, from psychological to gas to chest wounds. And they were not destroyed by this. And I asked myself why, and try to explain it through this book, Daughters of Mars, in which two girls from Kempsey, New South Wales, two sisters become volunteer nurses. And yeah, I love that book. I love the two women because, as you know, your characters are at first strangers to you and you get close to them. And these girls are not of the loud, raucous Irish tradition, but of the reserved, primitive Methodist tradition. And so, I got to know and love them. It didn't stop me at the end of the book killing one of them.
Oh, don't tell us. So we're going to give it all away because some people may not have read it yet. Tom, I've got two questions for you before we're going to end. And while I'm asking you the questions, one thing I'd like you to think about, are there some books you'd like to recommend for Thursday Book Club? But I'll ask you that right at the end. Elizabeth Walton has this question. Is the novel alive and well, or is it nearing the end of its narrative arc as a form of writing?
It's peculiar. I don't think it's nearing the end. It will continue one way or another. The reason I think it will continue is that the novel is one of the forms that human sensibility takes. And I don't think, even though there's no money in it, I don't think we will ever give it up. Our universities, our streets, our pubs, our get-togethers are full of young people who want to reproduce something in the form of the novel. Now, in the novel, you tell the truth by telling lies. You tell the ultimate truths about human beings by telling lies, by getting really into the skin of a witness to events and a victim of events and speaking with their authenticity. And I don't think the appetite of people for this to happen will ever die, because the book still exists. After every excuse to die, it still exists, even if it exists online. But even the physical book still has its clients, and it shouldn't. By all reasons of technology, it should have died by now, because there's no reason, human sentimentality, for it to live. But the reason it lives is that we are tactile animals. So even the young still buy physical books. And so I don't think this particular mode of expression is going to die. It might be, I mean, many of the people who used to want to be novelists will become people who want to tell it in novel, in filmic and other forms. I've got a young cousin in America, Zebediah Keneally, who his mother's Jewish and his father's Irish American. And he has produced a novel in a magazine form, 2 editions of Apatiamento. And he's actually online explaining it, a Zoom online, explaining it in a hotel in Sydney on Sunday. He's in New York, but he's talking to a group of readers in a hotel in Sydney. And I think Zebediah is an indication that this will never end, that deadbeats of Keneally's and Leal's and so on will still tell you, try to engage you in what they're saying.
Thank you. So
Into the future.
Elizabeth?
And people who've engaged me, there are many books that I would like to tell you about. Alexis Wright,
Yes.
her book, Capricornia. There's Jonathan Birch, an Aboriginal writer, and a third Aboriginal writer. That book by Anita Heiss, that is about the floods, and has an Aboriginal name, and I should know it with the fluency.
River of Dreams, I think, is the English translation.
It's the English translation, and it's about Aboriginals who save white guys in a bark canoe. It actually happened in Gundagai in the 1830s, in the flood in the 1830s. That I know a great Aboriginal rugby league footballer, Cliffy Lyons. His ancestor is one of the two saviors in his direct ancestor. And I have a copy of Anita Heiss's novel for him, which I never managed to get to him at the football, because either he's not there, or if he is, that happens to be the day I've despaired of giving him the book. These are great books. There is a wonderful novel by a woman called Beto, a young novelist that you had on your show, and it's set in America.
Yeah, Emily Beto.
And what is the title of that book again?
Yes, Emily Beto. Oh, I can't see it. It's leave it with me. Someone's going to help me out with this one.
It's a great.
Emily
it's
Beto,
a great
and
book
it's a beautiful.
too.
What is it called? It's coming to me by the end of this.
Thank you. I'm sorry I've forgotten it. I knew it this morning when I checked on it.
I've known it for ages. We'll find it very soon. One last question, Tom, for you, which is from Greg. And Greg says, Tom, wonderful to hear you talk about your books, even those unwritten or never to be written. After your remarks 2 weeks ago about republicanism, and given the outpouring of grief in the wake of the Queen's death, what do you think of the chances of republicanism this time in the colonies, or even the homeland, in the reign of King Charles?
Well, I think what will drive us towards an ultimate republic will be the Aboriginal issue and the issue of the voice from the centre. I think that this is the job that's on our slate now. And I think that we will recognize the voice from the centre and recognize the voice from 80,000 years at least of Aboriginal occupation. We were not conscious of all this as we were when the issue of the referendum came up last time. But you can't have homeland and Aboriginal sovereignty exist together. And the idea of the crown was plastered on the earth by Europeans. We now know that our culture is only a fragment of Aboriginal occupation. And this has altered our imaginations and will alter our imaginations in the future. So that we've gone from having that dead heart that I spoke of at the beginning when I was young, that 1939 heart, where the center of Australia is a woman beyond her change of life. No, it's not. It's a booming center. It is a place where people have always had a smorgasbord of desert foods, of desert creatures, and of desert, and therefore the dead heart has become a living heart in my lifetime. And with our knowledge of that heart, of how thoroughly that center has been lived in, then inevitably we will see ourselves as requiring one of our own to represent us, rather than placing our hopes of who we are 17,000 miles offshore. So they are connected. Are we a British colony, or are we something unprecedented? I think we're something unprecedented. Even the location, there was no Australian poetry studied when I was a kid. Because I did English honours, the teacher led us to the back of the room where there was Australian poetry. Lo and behold, there was a continuation of the singing of Australia by Judith Wright and by the journalist who wrote
Slessor, Kenneth Slessor? No.
Kenneth Slessor, yeah.
Yes.
Wrote, Three Bells, and wrote Country Towns, and therefore our imagination, the European imagination in Australia, treating Australia as more, as its own place, not the anti-Europe, not the a-Europe. It doesn't. The Australian landscape isn't trying to be anything except itself. And we are the first generation or second generation who's written about it in its own terms, not as the anti-Europe, but as the statement of what it is. So we've barely scratched the surface of what the Aboriginals have been doing for 80,000 years. And I think we know that. Now, we will inevitably become our own people in the light of that imagining. And but it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Thank you, Tom. I've just got an answer from Elizabeth Walton, who was your first questioner. She said, what a delightful answer about the novel. Thank you very much. And Elizabeth Walton, also a writer herself, has given us the answer we need, which is Wild Abandon, of course, by Emily Bitto, who won the
Yes, Wild Abandon.
Yes, that's it.
Why do I always forget names unless they're novel titles now as an old bloke, unless they've got a name in them or a geographic location.
Oh, that's interesting.
Peculiar.
And she's got The Strays, which was her first book, which won the Stella Prize, and she's got Wild Abandon. Great.
Now, yes.
There we
The
go.
Strays isn't a slouchy novel either. There are young writers, like I consider you a young writer, for example. Your age and younger are writing wonderful stuff. There's a bloke called Arnott.
Yes, Robbie Arnott.
Remotely related to the Arnotts who owned Homebush when I was a kid. And he used to bake their shortbread in Homebush. And he's a great novelist too.
Yes.
And these people are going to set Australia alight in the end.
Excellent.
God bless them. And they shouldn't even want to write a novel, according to Marshall McLuhan. They should be totally tribalized by television, but thank God they're not.
And can I say, Tom, you have set Australia alight with your enthusiasm, your enormous generosity towards writers, towards the community, and the wealth of topics and stories that you write. And I'm so delighted that you've spent so much time with us tonight. You can't believe how happy we all are to have had you to ourselves.
It's great that you started this to give us a voice in COVID when all the other venues were closing down.
Thank you.
So thank you, Suzanne. This is an important service you give to other hacks.
Thank you, Tom. And you are most welcome anytime, as much as you like to come back to us, Tom. We feel like you're ours. So thank you very much.
Greetings to all your people.
Thank
I
you.
saw an old friend of mine amongst the people at the start of
Excellent. Good, good,
a
good.
woman who's always turns up loyally to hear the old bugger rave on. So thank you.
Oh, fantastic. And we'll be recording this, so you can watch it time and time again. Thank you so much again, Tom, and enjoy the rest of your night, everybody. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.